All right, good morning. You don't know this, but this is our second try. We're taking two because I had it wrong. And I'm going to begin with this. We're talking about the church over these past few Sundays and over the coming Sundays. We're looking at the church, different things about the church. One was part of Ephesians. That was the offices of the church, the unity of the church. That's in Ephesians 4. It's also in 1 Corinthians 12 and Romans 12. Before that, we also talked about leaving. You have to leave and to go someplace else. You have to leave someplace. And so to become part of the church means to leave something. Maybe for people that was the pagan religions. You can't mix them together. We have some of that happening in voodooism. There's a little bit of Christianity, a little bit of animism, a little bit. It doesn't work that way. Now, I'm not saying there's not a reality there. I had a teacher in seminary who had lived in the Caribbean, and he knew what animism and voodoo was all about. And he said, it's real, but it's not of God. It's of the devil and demon possession, but it's still real. And that kind of thing. Now, we're going to talk about baptism last week and communion. And this time, we're talking about the Lord's Day. Now, it's only mentioned once in the whole Bible. And that's in the book of Revelation, the first chapter, where John says, I was caught up in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. That's the only mention of the Lord's Day in the whole Bible. There are mentions of the Sabbath, of course. The Sabbath being Saturday, the last day of the week. And we have gotten so used to Sunday that we speak of Saturday and Sunday as being the weekend. But Sunday is really the first day of the week. And that's also referred to in the Bible as a time. Paul will write to the church at Corinth, and he says to them, come together on the first day of the week with your offerings for the church. Now, many of the people in the beginning of the church were Jewish people. Okay, Paul preaches on, especially his third missionary journeys, pretty much exclusively with Gentiles, that is, non-Jewish people. But when he's first going out on his first trip, there are, in the synagogues, what we call God-fearers. These are not Jewish people. These are Gentiles. Some of them, many of them, are Roman. Some of them are Roman soldiers. And they come to the synagogue and they find something there. There is a particular God-fear in the book of Acts where Philip, one of the deacons of the church, is taken over outside of Jerusalem. But we don't know how it happened. Caught up in the Spirit, it says. But he finds himself over near Caesarea. There's an Ethiopian eunuch. That is, he's a servant of Candace, the queen of Ethiopia. He's been in Jerusalem. He's been there, doesn't tell us exactly why, but probably been there because he has a hunger to know God better than what he's finding in Ethiopia, in the religions of the people there. And so he's come to Jerusalem. He's heading back. He's reading the Old Testament scriptures, Isaiah 53 in particular. He doesn't understand it. Philip is there and walks along beside and finally jumps up into the chariot and says, do you understand what you're reading? He says, no, I don't. And so Philip explains it to him. Now, he's a God-fearer. And he becomes a Christian, as Philip explains it. There is Peter, and he's at... I'm trying to think of the name of the town by the sea. Begins with A, and I can't recall it exactly, but he's there at the home of Simon the Tanner, which is an interesting statement because a tanner is an unclean person. and he's staying at that house of the Simon the Tanner. Anyway, he goes up to take a nap at noontime, has a vision of a blanket coming down with all kinds of animals in it, and he hears the word rise, kill, and eat. And these are all unclean animals that you wouldn't be allowed to eat, like pork, groundhog, lobster, all those which are described as unclean in the Old Testament. And so he says, I can't do that. Then it happens again. Rise, kill, and eat. And he says, I can't do that. this is unclean. I can't do that. Third time it happens. 3 times is very significant in the Bible. All right, it's a completion. If you think of the number of 3s, certainly the Trinity is a 3 factor, and there are other factors that come up with 3 in terms of the Bible. All right, now 3 times this happens, and then there's a knock on the door. There's a centurion there. That's a Roman soldier. He has been deployed into the land of Israel. A centurion usually guards or commands 100 soldiers. So it's not a light job. It's been likened to a sergeant, but I think it's more up a higher rank than that. But it is what we would say an enlisted man's rank. Maybe master sergeant or super sergeant or something like that. But anyway, he has been instructed in a vision to go to the Joppa, is the name of the city that Peter is staying in, with Simon the tanner, Joppa. And he's been instructed to go to Joppa to a tanner's house. Now that would be an easy way to find somebody, because tanners aren't all over the place because they're unclean and they're limited in their contact. But go to this house of Simon the tanner, and a person there will instruct you. He's a God-fearer. He comes and he tells them, I had this vision, and Peter is able to explain who Jesus is and what salvation is all about. And the Spirit comes on them and they speak in tongues. Now that becomes an evidence of it. Baptism is not so much an evidence as an experience of believing. The coming of the Spirit is evidence that the Spirit is there. And that becomes for Peter the proof that God is also interested in Gentiles. So we have this seventh day factor that's in there. Peter is a seventh day worshiper. He has not become a Sunday worshiper at this point. At this point, he's there. Now, I'll back up on that a little bit. But it says that in the Acts that the apostles were in the temple daily. Okay? They went to the temple, and particularly for the afternoon prayers that were done at the afternoon sacrifice. And particularly on the Sabbath, because that was the special day, and the sacrifices were accompanied with singing and with a worship experience. So they were there. Now, the Sabbath is there. And if you go to the Old Testament, that's found in Exodus chapter 20, where the 10 Commandments are given. And the 4th commandment is, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And in Exodus it says, because in 6 days God made the earth and all that is in it, and on the 7th day he rested. Now that's Exodus chapter 20. Okay, that it tells that. If you go to Deuteronomy chapter 5, it gives you the same 10 commandments, but when it comes to remember the Sabbath, it says, remember that you were slaves in Egypt and you had no rest. And God brought you out and gave you rest. A little bit different reasoning in terms of that. The whole idea there is in both of them that there's a stop, there's a cessation of activity. The question of it is why? Well, because one, God accomplished what he needed to accomplish in 6 days, and he's saying, you need that as well. And he's also saying, you worked 7 days a week as slaves in Egypt, and you had no rest. And God said, you need to have rest. That is a time of broken. And so does your people. And so do your animals. And so does your land. Now, over 7 days you did not farm it. I mean, you rested from your labor, but the crops were still planted. The crops were still growing. But every 7th year, you let the ground lie fallow. The ground rested. And we know that there's a renourishing that happens. For instance, when I was a kid, crops were planted on the same ground year after year after year, so that they would deplete the nutrients in the soil. And the Farm Bureau and farm organization said every other year, or every 2 or 3 years, not every other year, but every 2 or 3 years, stop planting corn, oats, wheat, beans, plant alfalfa. Plant alfalfa. Well, alfalfa is a wonderful plant. Animals love it. But alfalfa puts nitrogen back into the soil that other crops will take out of the soil. It enriches the soil while it grows and makes it healthy again. So if you leave the ground fallow, then you do that. Now in the South, they planted cotton. They planted cotton and they planted cotton until they destroyed the soil. And it wouldn't grow much of anything. Now, with fertilizers and with restoration, they brought back life to the soil. But cotton is not the king that it used to be in the South. They still grow it there, but it's not the king. So everything needs rest, and talks about that from our labor, and says now there's also then the same idea that we also need to be active and busy. But we need to stop at some point and rest. Places of rest are important. If you drive along the highway, you will come across rest stops. Now, I've seen people at them and they're more active than on the road. They're walking around, they're doing this, they're taking their dog for a walk or doing this other thing and that. They're getting food to eat, they're having all that. But there are people that are resting. They're sitting on a bench, and sometimes they lay on the bench and just rest their eyes and stuff so they can go on. Sometimes pull over at a rest stop and you stay in your car, but you put the seat back and you sleep a couple of hours so that you're resting. Truckers, George is a trucker. There are mandatory times when you have to pull off the road and rest. Now you may eat your lunch at that time, you may get out and walk a little bit, you may sleep a little bit, but you're not driving. And I guess, do they have monitors on that can tell if that truck is still running? Yeah. See, we had that when I was a kid driving bus. We had the clock on the thing, could tell how fast the bus driver was going. Now when I started driving bus, they had taken all those off, but we had bus drivers that went a little too fast, and they put these machines on there, and then they had governors put on there, so you couldn't drive. Now if it was a 10-mile-an-hour zone, you could still drive 30 miles an hour in it, but you couldn't get over the speed limit, and usually that was set at 35 for school buses back then.
Yeah, GPS is on them, so they know when the truck's moving.
So you have that monitor.
Yep.
Yeah. And it's probably a good thing that we have that. I know Snyder'S drivers get ridiculed some because they have to stay under 55 on the 55 roads and stuff like that because it's all monitored and they know where they are. That's okay. It's a good thing. There'll be Snyder'S trucks around for a long time and stuff on that. But anyway, be that as it may, there's a place in Florida called Bachman Memorial Gardens. I don't think it's a religious place, but it's there. And Mr. Bachman was a wealthy businessman, and he bought this land as his own place of retreat to come there. There's a Carillon Tower there. And I say it's not necessarily a religious place because there's a Carillon Tower. I don't ever remember reading that there was a chapel there. But there's a Carillon, and it plays music, and I don't know whether it plays hymns or not. Again, I have a book on it, but it's up in my barn. Now, if you don't know about my barn and the hay mow, and there's no hay, but there's all kinds of books up there, and I can't find it. But it's there, someplace. But anyway, there's a plaque on that tower of the Carillon that says, "I come here to find myself. It is so easy to get lost in the world." See, and that's what he did. He get caught up in business and doing this and doing that and doing the other thing. And he needed to find a place to find himself. Now, if you go down to Camp Fort Hunter, or Fort Hunter, down along Route 322, there's a chapel there. Why is there a chapel? Well, of course, it was a community at one time, Fort Hunter was. There's the house there, the mansion, and there was a fort there, and other things like that. It was also a stop along the canal, the Pennsylvania Canal. But why would you put a chapel there? Well, probably so that people could find a place of stopping and resting and thinking. Now, that chapel is used on other days. You can have weddings there on a Saturday, or you can have a wedding there on a Friday. You just have to make arrangements to have that chapel open. But it's a place of special thought and stopping. Now, I've been to Valley Forge, the national camp at Valley Forge, where the soldiers stayed on that first winter with George Washington and stuff. And many died and suffered there. There's a chapel there today. I'm not sure that chapel was there when the soldiers were there. It might have been. It's been years since I've been there. But there's a carillon there, just like there was at Bachman Memorial Gardens and at other places. There's a carillon at Luray Caverns that's played inside the caverns. I have a recording of the hymns and stuff that they played inside that. I still remember being in those Luray Caverns. A very special place to be. I don't think I've ever been in other caverns. I've been in caves, but not caverns like that. You remember that experience. It's a place that somehow alters your thinking and your way of life. That's part of that. Now, let's get back to basics. We got a few more minutes here before George gives me the signal that says I'm over time. The disciples were worshiping on Saturday. That was the Sabbath, the day of rest. That was there were a group of people called Pharisees that made it difficult for people. Pharisees considered themselves more holy, set apart, special than the other people, the peasants and the common people. They were so holy that if a chicken laid an egg on the Sabbath, they would not eat it because the chicken worked on the Sabbath. If a person was injured on the Sabbath, they would wrap a bandage around the wound, but they would put no medicine on it because that would make the body heal, work on the Sabbath. If they wanted to go on a journey, you couldn't do it on the Sabbath. That was work. But they could take the day before and put a shoe partway along where they wanted to go, which was longer than a Sabbath day's journey. And so they would walk to that shoe. Well, you have your shoe at your home. So they could take that shoe and go on farther on their journey. Couldn't carry it because that would be work. But they could go on because they had been to their home. You see what? Now Jesus healed people on the Sabbath. And they found fault with him. And Jesus said, is it wrong to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil? That was, and it wasn't good to do evil on any day of the week. It was all right to heal, and Jesus healed on the Sabbath. One time his disciples were walking along, probably on a Sabbath day's journey, and they walked through a wheat field. They call it a cornfield, but it'd be a wheat field. And they pulled some grains off the stalk. That was not stealing. That was in the Old Testament that you were allowed to do that. You weren't allowed to go into the field. But as you walked along the path which went through the field, you could reach out and grab some heads of the grain, and you could eat them. They were for all the people. The thing about it is that when you put that grain in your mouth, you had to chew on it. Now you're working, you can't do that. And Jesus said, you provide food for yourself on the Sabbath. And I don't know what they provided. Maybe it was soup. Maybe it was soft mush. Something that didn't have to be chewed, it could be swallowed. But the whole point was, it was nourishing. It was nourishment. And it found fault with the disciples. Jesus said, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. In other words, it's there for our benefit, not for our slavery, to be owned by it. Now, there is a need for us to rest. There is a need for us to rethink. Recreation is that. I remember as a kid growing up, we didn't do the work on Sunday unless it had to be done. Well, we had to milk the cows on Sunday twice a day still. Otherwise, they'd go into milk fever, so you had to milk the cows. We had to feed the animals on Sunday, so we do that. And we made maple syrup. So if we tapped the trees and we hung the buckets, and we had to hung buckets when I was young. Now later on they got a pipeline, but we hung buckets. If the buckets were overflowing, that was wasting God's gift. So we would take the tractor and the bucket and gather the sap in the bucket. One time, our minister, Dick Pendle, came up to the farm. He said, if God's making the buckets overflow, I'm going to help you catch it. And and he gathered buckets with us on Sunday afternoon. We didn't boil, we just filled it into the tub, and so that they could fill up again, so we weren't wasting. So I think the Sabbath was made for us. Now, after we got all done, we could rest, and especially when we got all done having an extra hand there, we all were able to rest more. And that's a part of what it's all about. Now, why did the disciples start worshiping on Sunday then? Because they did. And that's called the Lord's Day, as it is in Revelation. It's called the first day of the week in Paul's letters to the church. He says, gather on the first day of the week to take up an offering. Gather on the first day of the week to share in the needs of others. So the early church, and particularly because it was mainly a Gentile church, was meeting on Sunday. And that was the day of the resurrection. Jesus rose on the first day of the week. Now, what does that mean in terms of changing thought? In the Old Testament, the Sabbath was you rested after your work to get strengthened again. In the New Testament, you rest before your work so that you have a perspective of what you're doing. And I think that's a good point. Now, it's not found in the Bible, but I think it's a good point that we begin by resting. And that's our faith. We don't earn our way to God. We begin by resting. Jesus said, come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. He said, take my yoke upon you. That yoke is an emblem or a symbol of work. But you will find my yoke is easy. Now that doesn't mean there's no weight. It means that it fits. It's designed for us. God doesn't give us any ill fit. You ever put on shoes that pinch? Or that had a thumbtack in them? Yeah, no fun. No fun. And sometimes they rub. I had to buy a new pair of boots because the boots I had, I can't put socks on, and they've been rubbing and I'm getting sores. So I bought a new pair of boots that are going to fit, and I can do the work better with that. Now the old pair I had that fit, they cracked and they broken, and I taped them, but we're in 10 inches of snow. That snow gets in there. And so I just said, I got to use something else, and I tried the other boots, and that hurts. Anyway, that's a part of it. Well, I'm going to stop there at that. I just wanted to set that up. I want to check my notes here and see if there was something else. Oh, okay. Yes, I got stopped by a policeman. I was riding my motorcycle, and I was coming from one town up in the north, from a town called Elkland, to the town I lived in called Knoxville. It's about 10 miles separate. And I'm driving my motorcycle, and I have a policeman pull up behind me, put his lights on. Wow, you don't just keep going, or you don't signal him to go by. You know, no, you pull over. And I did pull over. And he came up to me, and he knew me. He called me by my name and said, maybe it's seen my picture in the post office. I don't know. But anyway, he said, Jeff, you don't have a tail light. Well, I had a tail light, but the bulb had blown. And I didn't. You know what he told me to do? Drive with your turn signal on. Well, I'm not turning. The law says if you've got a turn signal on, you should be turning. He said, no, I want people to be able to see you and know that you're there. You to drive with your turn signal on. If they get upset, they'll pass you or whatever they need to do. You just drive with that turn signal on. See, the law said only a turn signal if you're turning. The Spirit said, save the life, use the light. That's what Paul, as he writes, says, the letter of the law kills us. The spirit of the law gives us life. And that's what the Sunday issue is all about. My wife works as a nurse many, many days. She had to work in the hospital on Sunday. Police have to work on Sundays. They don't always work every Sunday, but they work on Sunday. My wife had to work at least once a month on a Sunday to help. So everybody, others didn't have to. Now sometimes you could change. You change with a Jewish person or even a Muslim because Sunday was not their holy day. And they would work on that. Otherwise, she worked every other Sunday. That wasn't once a month, it was every other Sunday. And same thing with Christmas. She'd get Christmas off one year, the next year she worked on Christmas. And we do the acts of mercy. We do the acts that bring life, that assist the Spirit. Okay, we need to stop there. Talk to you next. Father, in this day we give you thanks for giving to us rest and giving to us abilities and talents, giving to us a sense of your care and watch over us, and of our ability to enter in to the gifts of the Spirit. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, see you next week.